Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about the real impact of the Sony A9. And for all that it was touted as being a DSLR killer for its aggressive pricing when it was announced, we're not seeing it dominate quite yet. Hello, Allison. Yes, I believe we talked online. I'd like to go ahead and purchase your 1 hour Dominate by Day package. There's a couple of options in there that I'm particularly interested in. In all seriousness though, there was actually someone that we saw recently that was being led by a leash and collar through a public area into a store, and it was a little bit odd. It's like in public. Not exactly what I would choose to do. In my opinion video on the A9 back in April when it was released, I said there were a couple systemic issues that were plaguing the A9 at release. First being lens selection, second being accessories, and also pro services. But we've seen Sony be really aggressive about the lens offerings and building their pro services. So we have 12 to 24 at f4. We have 16 to 200 at 2.8 now. So in a lot of ways, the lenses are taken care of from a typical average pro's perspective. There might be still a need for a 400 f4, 600 f4, 400 maybe f2.8, 300 2.8, something like that. But I think largely they've kind of ironed out some of those early issues. But I don't think that the real impact of the A9 is itself. I think the A9 is not the ends, but the means. Can you handle the truth? Semiconductors develop much faster than mechanical apparatus, and it's very feasible that we could see in 2 to 3 years something like an A9 Mark II with 40 or 60 frames per second for stills with 80 or 120 autofocus calculations per second. Like, that's incredible. How cool would that be? But the sensor, the stacked CMOS sensor and its readout capabilities aren't the only really dope things that we're seeing out of the A9. Also the processor. The processor is already being put into Sony's current generation of cameras, namely the RX10 Mark IV, hugely amplifying its performance. The RX10 Mark III went from contrast-only base autofocus system and 14 FPS to the Mark IV being 24 FPS with 315 phase detect autofocus points. With the kind of data transfer we're seeing through the A9's processor without it overheating, either with stills or 4K, we're seeing about a 480 megabit per second throughput, if you will. And so on an A7R Mark III or Mark IV, we could very easily see, if they choose to implement this processor alongside that sensor that they'd use, you could see something like 60 megapixels at 8 frames per second. Practically, you know, a 60 megapixel sports camera in a lot of ways. Could also maybe downsize for faster FPS. Could see an A7S 3 or 4 with 6K, all without the overheating issues that have plagued for some Sony's mirrorless interchangeable lens camera offerings, much like a fatty in a sauna. And the thing is, when it comes to economies of scale, Sony is just as intelligent as Canon is at keeping costs down. The same sensors in the Alpha 6300 and the Alpha 6500, and Sony tends to put the same processor in every generation of cameras that they make. So it's reasonable, in my opinion, to expect that we can see the A9's processor in any upcoming APS-C mirrorless cameras they offer, or an A77 Mark III, or the A7 III series, most notably. That would also amplify radically the performance we're seeing out of all of their mirrorless interchangeable lens camera offerings, much like an EDM festival. What does that mean, though? It means that the crazy amount of on-sensor phase detect autofocus points and the processing required to do it, and the crazy throughput through that processor and the efficiency required to do it well without overheating will continue. But perhaps most importantly, we'll really have to use our imaginations to see where Sony could go next. So the real impact of the A9, Sony's really squared away their color space, and they've very well paved the way for their next generation, or for their current generation perhaps, of mirrorless interchangeable lens camera offerings. But in many ways, I feel like the A9 is just as revolutionary as the 5D Mark II was for hybrid DSLR video for mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras. The A9 showed the world that mirrorless is here to stay, and mirrorless is the next wave of innovation within the imaging space, much like SLRs replaced twin lens reflex cameras and DSLRs replaced SLRs. I'm not saying mirrorless are going to replace DSLRs, but we're already seeing some of the really fundamental parts of the functionality of mirrorless cameras integrated into more traditional DSLRs, like the D850, with its extensive use of electronic shutter and so forth. Now, what we're not seeing on the D850 is on-sensor phase detect autofocus, but we're also seeing a backside illuminated 45 megapixel sensor that's incredible. And so a lot of those technologies are in a lot of ways as a direct result of Sony. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention in this video. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.